Dryaw airfield has been the home to Harold the helicopter for many years. Whenever there is danger or anyone who is in need of rescuing, Harold is always on standby. Harold is essential to the island of Sodor, and so too is the airfield. Percy has a great respect for the helicopter in his airbase. He knows how important they are, and in return, Harold has learned to understand how equally important the railway is to the island. But many are surprised to know that it wasn't due to the unique friendship that the two friends created that gave them a sense of respect to one another. It was all due to Percy's old driver. Mr. Richard Grange had once been a pilot for the RAF in the Second World War. He had been stationed at Dryaw airfield. He used to fly the Wellington bomber, which were used as anti-submarine aircraft as part of Coastal Command. They would escort the merchant navy safely out to sea and hunt down the German U-boats that lurked beneath the waves. After the war, he became a driver on the Northwestern Railway. He took a great interest in little Percy, but was always fond of aircraft. In fact, it was Richard Grange who made Percy race against Harold all those years ago. Now Richard was very old and had retired from the railway years ago, but he always liked to visit Percy and Harold, especially when they were together. He told them many stories of his days as a pilot at Dryaw airfield and the role it played during the war. Percy and Harold were always fascinated. On a glorious autumn morning, Richard was celebrating his birthday, and as a gift, he was given a ride in Harold the helicopter. "It would be an honour to fly the skies with you, Mr. Grange," smiled Harold happily. "How wonderful," said Richard excitedly. "I've never flown by helicopter before." Harold took off from the airfield. Richard looked down below. He could see Percy pulling a freight train. He whistled cheerfully as Harold flew overhead. They flew across fields and along the coastline. "Oh, this takes me back," grinned Richard. "Just like the good old days." Harold flew all around the island until at last he arrived back at the airfield. Richard had had a wonderful time and thanked Harold and his pilot for a memorable day. Percy and the Fat Controller were waiting for him at the station. The Fat Controller politely tipped his top hat. "It gives me great pleasure to inform you that your family are waiting for you at Knapford. You'll be dining on our Pullman service this evening, compliments of the railway." Richard beamed happily. "Oh, thank you, sir, that is awfully kind of you." Percy quickly cut in. "Did you enjoy your flight, Richard?" "Indeed, it was wonderful. I felt like a young pilot again," said Richard, "although it did feel a little strange when Harold hovered a few times." Percy chuckled. "I bet there are many stories that came flooding back to you." "Oh, yes, of course, Percy. But we shouldn't keep the Fat Controller or my family waiting any longer. Maybe for another time." Percy understood. Richard climbed on board, and Percy steamed quickly away. A few days later, Percy arrived at Dryaw with a parcel train. Harold was receiving attention close by. Richard had a splendid time on the Pullman train, called Percy, and he talked for hours about his trip with you. Harold felt very pleased. "Jolly good old chap, splendid to hear he enjoyed himself." "It's a surprise he even became an engine driver at all," joked Percy. "He has so many happy memories as a pilot. He belongs in the skies. I wonder why he didn't keep it up." Harold's smile turned to a subdued expression. "Percy, my dear fellow, the answer is rather grave." "Really? What is it?" "Well, Mr. Grange was a pilot during the war. You must remember that he would have seen terrible things far beyond what either of us could ever imagine," explained Harold carefully. "One can only presume it may have scarred him for life." Percy felt awful. Oh dear, that never once came to my mind." "Don't worry, Percy," soothed Harold. "We won't ever mention it." Percy agreed. That night, out at sea, HMS Monmouth was sailing to a training exercise up on the Scottish coast. As she sailed past the island of Sodor, she picked something up close by on her radar. "It appears to be another vessel, Captain," said an officer. The captain attempted to make contact with the vessel through his radio, but try as he might, all that could be picked up was white noise. Time and time again the captain tried to make contact, but it was no use. Suddenly, the radar picked something else up. This time it was moving much quicker. "Something's heading straight for us, Captain," cried the officer. "It's a torpedo," shouted the captain. "Action stations, quickly!" An alarm sounded throughout the ship and sailors ran to their posts. "Brace for impact," yelled the captain. The object was surging towards the ship at a tremendous speed, and then... silence. Nothing happened. The object had disappeared completely from the radar. The sailors were very confused. The captain gave a sigh of relief but felt very exasperated. "This matter will be investigated immediately." HMS Monmouth turned and hurried to the safety of Brendam docks. Once there, a huge investigation began. Government officials left no stone unturned. They questioned everyone at the docks. They even interrogated Bill and Ben, who had only arrived to deliver China clay. "An attempted attack on a naval vessel is a very serious offence," exclaimed an official. "Well, it wasn't us," snorted Bill. "We can't even swim," huffed Ben. The government officials soon concluded that the Navy's radar equipment was to blame, and that it falsely displayed the threat of an enemy attack. As unlikely as this seemed, there was no other evidence to suggest otherwise. A few nights later, a distress call was received by Brendam Docks headquarters. The dockmaster couldn't understand the message through the sounds of the white noise, but what he could hear was a different language. "It sounds German to me," said the dockmaster, puzzled, "but whatever they're saying, we must help them at once." An ocean-going tug was sent out to the rescue. The tug couldn't find a ship on his radar. All he could hear was the fuzziness of the white noise through their radio. The tug blew its whistle in the hope of attracting a reply. But no reply was heard. "People's lives are at serious risk," cried the tug. "We must send for Harold the helicopter to help in the search." Harold the helicopter was quickly on the scene. He too could hear the faint German voices on his radio. "Where's it coming from?" wondered Harold. "There's no sign of a ship in distress at all." Suddenly, the radio went silent. "That's strange. Where's it gone? I've lost it too," called the tug. Harold searched for hours, but he couldn't find the ship. Eventually, Harold had to admit defeat and had to fly back to Dryaw airfield for refueling. As he did, he could see Percy far below, finishing his mail run. Harold overtook him. "Hello, Harold," called Percy. But Harold didn't reply. He was too busy trying to figure out about the missing ship. He disappeared out of view. As Percy steamed along, he began to hear a droning noise from up above. "What's that?" asked Percy. The noise grew louder and louder. "It sounds like an aircraft's about to crash land," exclaimed the driver. Percy looked up. "I can't see anything." Suddenly there was a loud explosion and the ground trembled violently. Percy jumped in shock. "Harold!" he cried in horror. Percy raced to Dryaw station. He saw the airfield's emergency services rushing to the bottom of the runway. But to Percy's astonishment, there was Harold standing on his helipad being refueled. "Did you hear that, old boy?" quivered Harold. Percy nearly burst into tears. "Of course I did. I thought it was you." The two friends looked at each other with concerned faces. But what was even more concerning was no aircraft could be found. The emergency services inspected the entire airfield, but there was no sign of a crash. When dawn broke, it did little to resolve the mystery. No plane was discovered, and the tugboat out at sea had been ordered to give up his search for the missing vessel. The matter seemed to bother both Percy and Harold deeply until they met Richard Grange again on Remembrance Day. He was attending a memorial service at Dryaw airfield along with his surviving friends of the war. Richard came to speak to Percy and Harold. "You must be wondering what all these strange occurrences have been," he asked knowingly. "Yes, sir," murmured Percy, "but I don't think this is going to be a happy story." "You both knew I was a pilot during the war," began Richard. "It was a time filled with fond memories, but as you can understand, it was also a time filled with terror and abomination. My duty was to seek out the German U-boats and to protect the merchant navy convoys heading in and out of our waters. The convoys had to be protected at all costs, or the country would starve and we would lose the war. Whenever we discovered a U-boat, we forced them to surrender. Being located in our waters and with the Navy and the RAF a threat to them, they were easily outnumbered and would have no choice but to surrender. But one U-boat refused to surrender. My comrades discovered the U-boat in their plane. Before they got a chance to alert the Navy, a merchant ship was torpedoed. My comrades opened fire and a grisly fight broke out between the two. Distracted by the aircraft, the U-boat hadn't realized it was in range of a destroyer escorting the convoy. The destroyer opened fire and the U-boat began to sink. Even whilst they were sinking, the German U-boat kept on its relentless attack on my comrade's plane. Before the destroyer could deploy a lifeboat to the Germans, the U-boat sank, and all aboard her were claimed by the sea. My comrade's aircraft was badly damaged. One by one her twin engines shut down, and she crash-landed at the bottom of the runway. I lost 6 dear friends that day. There was a long pause. Harold broke the silence. "Is that why you gave up flying?" Richard quietly nodded his head. "I assume the German U-boat is still out at sea, looking for naval ships, and my friends are still in their Wellington, protecting the seas." Richard sighed sadly. "I hope one day they'll finally make peace." He picked up a poppy wreath, which was to be laid at the airfield's war memorial. Remembrance Day isn't just for those who died during the First World War. It is a day of remembrance for everyone who has fallen in a time of war, lest we forget.